In 1720, a single ship arrived at the port of Lisbon carrying something that would ultimately destroy one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. It wasn't an enemy fleet. It wasn't a plague. It was gold. Tons of it. Glittering, beautiful, absolutely devastating gold from the mountains of Brazil. And here's the terrifying part: the Portuguese celebrated. They threw festivals. They built palaces. They believed God himself had blessed their nation with infinite wealth. They had no idea they were celebrating their own death sentence. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how the richest nation in Europe became one of the poorest, how an empire that once controlled half the known world crumbled into irrelevance, and how the very treasure they pulled from Brazilian soil became the poison that destroyed everything their ancestors had built. This is not just history. This is a warning. Because the same mistake Portugal made 300 years ago is being made right now, by nations you know, by economies you trust, perhaps even by the country you live in. Stay with me, because what happened to Portugal will change how you see wealth, power, and the hidden dangers of sudden fortune. To understand how gold destroyed Portugal, we must first understand what Portugal was before the gold arrived. We must travel back to a time when this small nation on the edge of Europe commanded respect from emperors and sultans alike, when Portuguese ships sailed waters no European had ever seen, when the world itself was being redrawn by Portuguese hands. The story of Portuguese greatness begins not with wealth, but with poverty and desperation. In the early 1400s, Portugal was a small kingdom clinging to the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, hemmed in by the powerful kingdom of Castile, too poor to compete with the great trading cities of Italy, too weak to challenge the Ottoman Empire that controlled the lucrative overland routes to Asia. Everything valuable that came from the east, the spices that preserved food, the silk that clothed nobility, the gems and precious metals that filled royal treasuries, passed through Ottoman hands, and the Ottomans taxed every ounce of it. But Portugal had one thing no other European nation possessed in quite the same way. They had the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly before them, and they had a prince who looked at that infinite horizon and saw not an ending but a beginning. Prince Henry, whom history would call the Navigator, established a center of maritime research at Sagres, on the windswept southwestern tip of Europe. There, he gathered the finest minds of his age, astronomers, cartographers, shipbuilders, sailors with experience in unknown waters. His goals seemed impossible to his contemporaries. He wanted to find a sea route around Africa to reach the riches of Asia, bypassing the Ottoman stranglehold on eastern trade. Year after year, decade after decade, Portuguese ships pushed southward along the African coast. They developed new vessels, the caravels, with lateen sails that could tack against the wind, allowing them to return from voyages that previous ships could make only one way. They created new instruments and new techniques for celestial navigation. They mapped currents and winds and coastlines that no European had ever seen. The progress was slow. Men died. Ships were lost. Monsters were rumored to lurk in the waters near the equator. But the Portuguese pressed on with a determination that bordered on obsession. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias finally rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans connected. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey all the way to India, arriving at the wealthy trading port of Calicut with goods to trade and cannons to enforce his right to trade. This was the moment Portugal transformed from a poor kingdom into a world power. Within decades, Portuguese trading posts dotted the coasts of Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. They established themselves at Goa, which became the capital of their Asian empire. They captured Malacca, the crucial strait controlling trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. They reached the Spice Islands, the only place on earth where cloves and nutmeg grew. They established a trading post at Macau, becoming the first Europeans to trade regularly with China. They even reached Japan, introducing firearms that would transform Japanese warfare. The profits were beyond imagination. A single shipload of spices purchased in Asia for perhaps 2,000 ducats could be sold in Lisbon for over 200,000. Even accounting for the costs and risks of the voyage, the returns were astronomical. Portuguese merchants became among the richest in Europe. The crown, which took a substantial cut of all trade, filled its treasury. Lisbon transformed from a provincial city into a glittering capital where exotic goods from around the world could be purchased. But this wealth was not passive. It was not simply extracted from the ground or picked from trees. It required constant effort, constant innovation, constant reinvestment. The Portuguese had to maintain their ships in waters half a world away from home. They had to train generations of sailors and navigators. They had to defend their trading posts against local rulers, against Arab traders who resented their intrusion, against European rivals who envied their success. They had to negotiate complex political arrangements with dozens of different kingdoms and empires. The Asian Empire was dynamic, demanding, and dangerous. But it was also productive. It rewarded skill and courage and innovation. It created a society oriented toward achievement, toward building, toward the hard work of maintaining competitive advantage in a hostile world. Portugal in the 16th century was a nation that earned its wealth. And because they earned it through genuine capability, the earning of that wealth made them stronger, more skilled, more capable of earning more. Then came Brazil. Pedro Álvares Cabral had discovered the South American coast in 1500, almost by accident, when his fleet sailing to India swung too far west across the Atlantic. For nearly 2 centuries, Brazil remained a secondary concern, producing sugar on coastal plantations while the real profits continued to flow from Asia. But in the 1690s, Portuguese explorers called bandeirantes, pushing into the interior in search of indigenous people to enslave, discovered something that would change everything. Gold. The deposits they found in the highlands of Minas Gerais were unlike anything seen before. Rivers where you could simply wade in and collect gold dust by the handful. Hillsides where nuggets lay exposed on the surface. Veins of gold running through mountains that seemed to have no end. Conservative estimates suggest that over 1,000 tons of gold were extracted from Brazil during the 18th century, more than all the gold that had been mined in the previous 300 years of history combined. The gold rush that followed was the largest the world had ever seen. Portuguese emigrated by the hundreds of thousands. The population of the mining regions exploded. Entire towns sprang up seemingly overnight. The interior of Brazil, which had been virtually empty of Europeans, suddenly swarmed with miners, merchants, priests, prostitutes, and slaves imported by the shipload from Africa to work the deposits. And the gold flowed back to Portugal in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. At the peak, the royal fifth, the 20% tax the crown claimed on all gold production, exceeded 10 tons per year. Ships arrived in Lisbon so laden with treasure that they sat dangerously low in the water. The king could hardly count his wealth. Now, here is where we must pay very close attention. Because what Portugal did with this windfall would determine the fate of their empire. They faced a choice that every nation faces when sudden wealth arrives. They could invest the wealth in productive capacity, in education, in infrastructure, in industries that would continue to produce value long after the gold was gone. Or they could consume the wealth, spending it on luxuries and display, allowing it to flow through their fingers like the water in those Brazilian rivers. Portugal chose consumption. And that choice destroyed them. King João V, who reigned from 1706 to 1750, became intoxicated with the idea of making Portugal the most magnificent kingdom in Europe. He wanted to rival Louis XIV of France, to build palaces that would make Versailles seem modest, to transform Lisbon into a capital that would awe the world. He began with the Mafra National Palace, a complex of such staggering size and expense that it defies description. The palace contains over 1,200 rooms. It has almost 30,000 doors and windows. Its library holds nearly 40,000 rare books. The construction required a workforce of over 50,000 laborers at its peak, this in a country whose entire population was barely 3 million. The cost was astronomical. Historians estimate the project consumed over 200 million cruzados, a sum that could have built dozens of factories, hundreds of ships, schools and universities across the entire nation. Instead, it built empty rooms that the king would never even visit, corridors that no foot would walk, monuments to ego that would produce nothing, create nothing, sustain nothing. But João did not stop there. He lavished gold on churches and monasteries. He imported Italian marble by the shipload. He purchased French furniture, Flemish tapestries, German clocks, English cloth. He sent gifts of gold to the Pope so extravagant that the Vatican hardly knew what to do with them. He established a royal chapel with standards so elaborate that it employed a permanent orchestra and choir of over 200 musicians. The gold flowed into Portugal, and it flowed right back out again. Every luxury the king purchased, every marble column, every gilded altar, every brocade curtain, put money in the pockets of foreign craftsmen while Portuguese artisans stood idle. Every imported textile put another Portuguese weaver out of work. Every foreign purchase was a small cut, and together those cuts bled the nation dry. This is the essence of what economists would later call Dutch disease, though it was Portuguese disease long before any Dutch economist gave it a name. When a country suddenly gains enormous income from a single resource, its currency strengthens on international markets. This sounds good, but the effects are devastating for domestic industry. Portuguese manufactured goods became more expensive for foreign buyers. Portuguese farmers found it harder to export their products. At the same time, imported goods became cheaper, flooding the domestic market and undercutting local producers. Workshops that had operated for generations closed their doors. Skills that had been passed from father to son for centuries vanished within a single generation. Young Portuguese men who might have become master craftsmen instead became minor nobles living on gold stipends, or emigrated to Brazil hoping to strike it rich themselves. The Asian Empire, which had been the foundation of Portuguese greatness, was gradually abandoned. Maintaining trading posts on the far side of the world required constant investment in ships, sailors, soldiers, and diplomacy. Why bother, when gold flowed so easily from Brazil? One by one, Portuguese positions in Asia fell to the Dutch, the English, and local powers who saw Portuguese weakness and exploited it. By the mid-18th century, Goa and Macau were virtually all that remained of an empire that had once stretched from Mozambique to Nagasaki. The Treaty of Methuen, signed in 1703, crystallized Portugal's new dependency. Under its terms, Portugal agreed to admit English textiles duty-free, while England would favor Portuguese wines. On paper, it seemed like a fair exchange. In practice, it was a catastrophe. English cloth flooded the Portuguese market. The textile industry, which had once been a significant part of the Portuguese economy, collapsed completely. English merchants set up shop in Lisbon and Porto, handling trade that Portuguese merchants had once controlled. Portuguese wine flowed to England, but wine was a raw agricultural product, while textiles were manufactured goods. The exchange trapped Portugal in a colonial-style dependency, exporting primary products and importing manufactured goods, a pattern we now recognize as characteristic of underdevelopment. And through it all, the gold continued to flow, but not to Portuguese benefit. Historians have traced the flows with remarkable precision. Perhaps 15% of Brazilian gold remained in Portugal. The rest flowed outward, to pay for all those imports, to settle all those debts, to purchase all those luxuries. The largest single recipient was England, which received a golden flood that helped finance the early Industrial Revolution. Think about this irony. The gold that was supposed to make Portugal the richest nation in Europe instead financed the industrialization of its greatest rival. British factories were built with Portuguese gold. British innovations were funded with Portuguese gold. British power was constructed on a foundation of Portuguese gold. And Portugal received nothing in return but empty consumer goods, already consumed and forgotten while British factories continued to produce. Some Portuguese understood what was happening. Luís de Cunha, a diplomat, warned that the gold was a curse that was destroying Portuguese industry and making the nation dependent on foreigners. The Marquis of Pombal, who became the effective ruler of Portugal under King José I in the 1750s, tried desperately to reverse course. Pombal established royal factories to manufacture textiles and glass and other goods that Portugal had been importing. He tried to reduce the power of the English merchants who dominated Portuguese trade. He reformed education, established new schools, attempted to create a more skilled and productive population. He even reduced the power of the Inquisition, which had been suppressing the kind of free thinking that might have led to innovation. Some of his reforms showed promise. Portuguese industry began to show signs of life. The dependence on England decreased slightly. There were glimpses of what might have been possible if reform had come earlier and been sustained longer. But Pombal was fighting against decades of decay. The skills that had been lost could not be rebuilt in a few years. The habits of consumption could not be transformed overnight into habits of production. The gold was already running out, and with it the wealth that might have funded a longer-term transformation. When Pombal fell from power after the death of José I, his reforms were largely abandoned. The nobles and clergy he had tried to weaken regained their influence. The factories he had established declined. Portugal slid back into its comfortable dependency, consuming foreign goods, exporting wine and colonial products, watching as the rest of Europe industrialized and pulled further and further ahead. The 19th century brought catastrophe after catastrophe. Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, establishing their court in Rio de Janeiro. When they returned after Napoleon's defeat, Brazil declared independence, and Portugal lost the colony that had been its primary source of wealth for over a century. What remained was a small, poor country on the edge of Europe, with no industry, no skilled workforce, no capital, and no prospects. The gold was gone. The Asian Empire was gone. The American Empire was gone. Even the wine trade faced increasing competition from Spain, France, and Italy. Portugal in the late 19th century was a nation living on memories. The Great Age of Discovery was 200 years in the past. The golden age of Brazilian wealth was fading from living memory. All that remained were the palaces, the churches, the monuments built with gold that might have built a different future. The final humiliation came in 1890. Portugal had dreams of connecting its African colonies of Angola and Mozambique, creating a trans-African empire shown in pink on their maps. The pink map, they called it, and it represented their last hope of imperial significance. But the British had their own plans for Africa, including a Cape to Cairo route that would pass directly through the territory Portugal claimed. When the British issued an ultimatum demanding Portuguese withdrawal, Portugal had no choice but to comply. They had no army that could challenge British power. They had no navy worth mentioning. They had no industrial capacity to support a war. They had nothing but their pink map and their memories of greatness. The ultimatum produced a crisis of national confidence. There were calls for war, for resistance, for standing up to British arrogance. But everyone knew, in their hearts, that war was impossible. Portugal capitulated, withdrew from the disputed territories, and watched as Britain carved up the African interior according to its own designs. This was what gold had purchased. Not eternal wealth. Not permanent power. Not security and prosperity for future generations. Instead, gold had purchased a century of consumption, a century of luxury, a century of forgetting how to do the hard things that had made Portugal great, and then 2 centuries of paying the price. The story of Portugal's golden curse is not merely historical tragedy. It is a pattern that has repeated throughout history, and is repeating today. Spain, which received even larger quantities of silver from its American colonies, experienced a similar decline. The silver funded wars and consumption while Spanish industry withered. By the 19th century, Spain too was a shadow of its former self. In our own time, we have seen the resource curse strike again and again. Oil-rich nations that have failed to develop diversified economies. Mineral-wealthy countries where the population remains poor while elites consume the proceeds. Even developed nations that have discovered resources have sometimes fallen victim, Norway being the notable exception that proves the rule, having carefully saved and invested its oil wealth rather than consuming it. But the parallel that should concern us most is not about natural resources at all. It is about money itself. In the decade since 1971, when the last link between currency and gold was severed, governments around the world have gained the ability to create money from nothing. This is not quite the same as discovering gold in Brazil, but the effects can be remarkably similar. When governments can fund their spending by printing money rather than taxing or borrowing from willing lenders, they face the same temptation that destroyed Portugal. Why do the hard work of building productive capacity when you can simply create money to buy what you need from others? Why invest in education and infrastructure and innovation when you can maintain your current lifestyle through monetary expansion? Look at the trade deficits. Look at the national debts. Look at the manufacturing sectors that have been hollowed out as nations chose consumption over production. Look at the inflation that is eroding savings and wages. The patterns are not identical to 18th century Portugal, but the family resemblance is unmistakable. And just as Portuguese gold ultimately flowed to England, enriching a nation that used the gold productively, today's monetary flows often end up enriching nations that still maintain productive capacity. The factories that might have been built at home are built elsewhere. The skills that might have been developed domestically are developed in other countries. The dependency deepens, even as the illusion of wealth persists. Portugal's tragedy was that they could not see what was happening until it was too late. The gold felt like blessing. The consumption felt like prosperity. The decline of industry felt like progress toward a leisured society. Only in retrospect, only after the gold was gone and the bills came due, did the full horror of their mistake become apparent. We have the advantage of knowing Portugal's story. We can see the pattern. We can understand how easy wealth undermines the habits and institutions that create genuine prosperity. We can recognize the signs of Dutch disease, of the resource curse, of the slow poison of consumption without production. The question is whether we will learn from Portugal's fatal mistake, or whether we are doomed to repeat it. Every nation that relies on something other than its own productive capacity, whether that something is gold from the ground, or money from the printing press, or credit from willing lenders, is running the Portuguese experiment again. Every nation that allows its industries to wither while consuming imported goods is following the Portuguese path. Every nation that builds palaces while its foundations rot is making the Portuguese choice. The ships still sail into harbor. The treasure still flows. The palaces still rise. The festivals still celebrate what feels like divine favor. And somewhere in the future, the gold will run out, the credit will dry up, the gain will end, and the heirs of today's choices will inherit the consequences. Portugal found gold and lost an empire. What are we finding? And what are we losing? These are the questions that history asks us to consider. These are the patterns that the past reveals to those willing to see. If this exploration has given you new ways to think about wealth, about power, about the hidden dangers that accompany good fortune, then I hope you will share your reflections. What patterns do you see repeating today? What nations are making Portugal's mistake? What might be done differently? The conversation matters because history is not just about the past, it is about choices we are making right now, choices whose consequences will echo for generations. If these historical investigations help illuminate your understanding, consider staying with us as we continue to explore the patterns that connect past and present.